And so I hope the people that weren't here last time had time to go through some of the slides from 2 weeks ago and sort of review the analysis of simple objects because this sort of, or single objects because this feeds off of that and sort of assumes that you've covered those topics and are familiar with what we've covered there. After the analyzing complex objects, we then move off of sort of the single object analysis to looking at spatial distributions. So once you have many objects that you've analyzed, what you can do with them to extract meaningful parameters from these sort of distributions and sort of the relationships between these large groups of objects. And then sort of statistics, reproducibility, dynamic experiments, and scaling up. And so this sort of concludes the intro part of the course, and then it will move on to sort of the more advanced and interesting topics and how you actually apply these core concepts to solving problems. And so, yeah, we'll go into that in more detail later. So again, for the literature, several of the books are the same as they were before. Two of the metrics we'll introduce today are thickness and curvature. We just go into sort of cursory detail about both of these ideas. And so if you're interested in learning more, you can go look at these resources as starting points. There's, of course, lots more written about these topics, but it's a good place to kind of get comfortable with a bit more of the terminology and see a different presentation of it, which can be helpful for understanding. So, sort of briefly what we've done before, which is kind of this intro part of the course. We had this image enhancement. We then did the segmentation and we understood how you can segment these images into separate pieces. We can use automatic methods to process many of these image data sets and get to the point where you can extract the values you want without having to manually tune the parameters. Then regions of interest, component labeling, and single shape analysis. And so the single shape analysis was how do you take a simple object and determine things like orientation, volume, area, surface area, we covered at the very end, and several other basic parameters. And so that's if you have an object that's like a cell or a sphere, that single shape analysis works very well for classifying that kind of object. Of course, most of the objects we deal with in reality are more complicated, and so that's where this sort of reaches its limits. So, and sort of the motivation initially is, why and how do we need more advanced analysis tools for this? The first sort of tool that we'll introduce is called the distance map. And sort of we'll talk about what is it and what can it be useful for, because it's really the basis for a lot of the other tools that we'll use. And it's one of the more robust analyses that we can perform. Then we talk about skeletons briefly. And so skeleton means sort of exactly what you would think it means. And so when you have, a person, skeleton is sort of the bone structure that goes inside of you. And with 3D objects or 2D objects, the skeleton is sort of these ridge points that basically describe the structure without having all of the points in it. And so we'll talk about exactly what that means and how we can calculate that from these structures. The next topic is thickness maps, which is really related to distance maps, but it's one step further in the analysis. And that gives us then a thickness description of the images and how we can calculate that with skeletons efficiently. We then move on to kind of more segmentation approaches. And so this watershed segmentation allows us to take objects that are connected together and separate them. And we'll just talk about sort of the simpler approaches to do with watershed, but there are more complicated methods that you can apply to use watershed well. And then curvature. And so curvature we won't go into too much detail because unfortunately it's not a very robust analysis. It's very sensitive to noise and other sorts of defects in your image, but it can be useful in many circumstances, and particularly for chemists and biologists, physicists as well. This is a very meaningful metric to extract when you're trying to model systems. And so understanding how strongly a surface is curved can affect sort of the chemistry that happens around the surface, and that's quite important when you're looking at metals, for example, and how they coarsen. So, as kind of the brief outline of the objectives that we want to cover, there's a bunch of sort of open questions here. I would say the important ones are really sort of the topology of a structure. And so right now, I mean, again, we talked about this problem that you start off with 56 gigabytes of image data. You then do segmentation and you get down to maybe a gigabyte or a couple hundred megabytes. You then start to do shape analysis and you reduce it even further. But how do you get sort of the essential information out of a structure without keeping all of the image data? So how can you get the simplest representation that isn't oversimplified? Because of course, if you take the mean intensity of an image, that's a very simple representation, but it doesn't tell you anything about your structure. And so what does this topology mean and how can we extract it? Sort of the next big question here is how can we measure sizes in complicated objects? And so we saw that it was quite easy. If you have a sphere, that the volume gives you a pretty meaningful piece of information, and then you take the cube root of it and divide by a scaling factor, and you get the radius, and that's also very helpful. If you have more complicated objects, then what does the volume actually mean? And how can you get sort of a radius out of that volume? Because if it's not a sphere anymore, you don't have that information. And so again, that's really important for processes like diffusion and coarsening, where it's important to know sort of these dimensions that things can flow through for doing simulations and other sorts of analyses. And so that's really what drives the interest in measuring the sizes. It's not simply to quantify the structure, it's for actually sort of understanding how diffusion processes work and bringing a metric that can quantify that process a little bit. And so that makes then comparing many different objects or many complicated objects much easier, because instead of having to compare an image pixel by pixel, you can just compare these sizes. Again, so if you have separate objects that are separate, but they're connected in physical space, then this component labeling approach that we used before isn't helpful. And so how can you separate those objects? Or what are some of the options you have for separating them? And then sort of the surfaces, and how can we investigate them in more detail? And how can we look at things like shape in particular when objects grow? And so last time we talked about anisotropy. Now, this was a very helpful metric because it's scale free, which means if your object changes in scale, so if it's growing, you can still measure anisotropy and compare them. And with a lot of the other metrics that you have, if you have something like volume, you can't compare volume in a growing object because it doesn't tell you anything. And so if you can come up with factors that are independent of the scale, then you can see if the object is simply growing or if it's growing and changing, because there's typically different processes that drive them. So if we go back to kind of what we wanted to do in the first place, we have this simple example with the cell. And again, we use a cell because those are the images that we have. You could also do this with letters of the alphabet. So if you're trying to identify which letter you see in a text document, then you would end up with some sort of group of pixels like this, and you'd want to analyze it. And so a lot of these tools I specify here with cells, but they of course are much more generic than this. And actually, when you look at cell data or you look at handwriting data, they aren't all that different. You get a threshold, you get a bunch of objects, you have lots of noise. How can you separate the noise from what's interesting? The only advantage with handwriting data is you usually have a much better expectation of what you want to see. With a cell, you usually don't know exactly what you're expecting to see, and so it's harder to fit that into a model. But the ideas are more or less the same. And so the problem we had here is that the models we covered last time were really too simple for many shapes. And so when we look at sort of the bounding box, we see that that doesn't really describe the object at all, this sort of pink box around it. And then when we look at the ellipse, that describes the object better. So there's sort of less white space around it. But if this were 3 different objects, we've identified it as 1. So we see with our eyes quite clearly that those are 3 separate or potentially separate blocks. And how can we sort of have an algorithm recognize this as well? And so what we want to do is, separate it. And how can we divide it? Because then once we've divided it into the 3 pieces, then actually these elliptical models or bounding box models fit much better. Because most of these shapes, I mean, all 3 of these objects would be very well approximated by an ellipse. And so that's actually, the model's not the problem, it's the segmentation that only gives us 1 piece out of it. If we were then interested in this as sort of a network of objects, and so if these were 3 cells that were connected together, and we wanted to understand how much material could be exchanged between these cells, then sort of understanding how this bottleneck, or what's the smallest point where these cells are connected is, and how can we measure that? And so that's where sort of knowing the topology and being able to measure distances helps us a lot. And the tools that we've sort of developed so far won't give us any of that information. Then we sort of take another approach that this is maybe not a cell, or this is, a protein, so on a much higher resolution scale, and we want to understand sort of how do the docking sites look and find other proteins that could fit inside of a docking site like this. How could we quantify that? So you have a list of pixels, but how can you simplify this information or describe it in a way that you could easily compare it to many, many other structures and be able to identify what cells might be able to dock there. Boom. So the first tool that we'll cover here is distance map. And so basically what we do is we take a segmented image like we had before. We don't perform component labeling. We just have the object labeled to sort of 2 phases. And so the image we take might have multiple phases inside it, but in order to do a distance map meaningfully, we need to divide that into 2 phases. And so we need to somehow decide what's background and what's foreground. And this has quite an important implication because this will give us different sort of information when we run the analysis. And so what we do is we basically have this fairly simple definition that the distance map sort of is the minimal distance from each point. From each point in the foreground to the closest point in the background. And so that means for a point like this, the distance map will be 1, because the distance from this point to this point is 1. For this point in the middle of this object, what would we expect the distance map value to be? Yeah, so that's actually where it's quite important. So one of the things we have to define here is the distance operator that we use. Yeah, and so here, typically when you say distance map without any specification, what this means is a Euclidean distance map. And that's the ones we'll use in the exercises. But actually, you can define distance map with whatever distance metric you want. And so if this were a satellite image of a city, then Euclidean distance might not be the best metric because you can't drive sort of diagonally through, New York. You have to follow the roads, and so then you would use a different distance metric that sort of fit that better. So there's actually one called Manhattan or city block distance metric, which allows you to measure distances where the only allowed moves that you have are sort of vertical and horizontal. With this, though, we'll stick with the Euclidean distance map, and so what that means for this point is that this would be then square root of 2. And so basically we can calculate for all the points in the image, and we get sort of this result. And so we have, or this one's 2. So we end up getting this distance map for those objects. Sorry. This one's 2 because it's 2 away from that edge. The square root of 2 is when it's just touching an edge diagonally. But yeah, so that was a slight misstatement there. But you have this object, which is 2 away from the nearest object, and it would be sort of longer in this direction because each one of those diagonals is square root of 2 rather than being just one single unit length. But basically what this gives us is a map for the entire object that shows us how far away each point is from the point we're looking at. We can see then for the Manhattan or city block distance that this looks very similar. The main difference we have is that these corner points, so these points that are sort of light green here, then switch to being 2 because this diagonal move isn't allowed anymore. And there's actually an even further sort of distance metric that you can use, which we have in the Python exercises if you look at them, which is called chessboard distance metric. And that's where diagonal moves are allowed as well, but these sort of quasi-diagonal moves aren't allowed anymore. I haven't actually checked if sort of rook moves are allowed, but or no, knight moves are allowed, but you can check that out on your own if you're interested. But basically, these metrics can be made however you want to make them, and whatever distance metric makes the most sense for your sample. So city block distance probably doesn't make sense for most cell biology samples, but it would make a lot of sense for cartograph, sort of maps or other similar problems like that. And fundamentally, the city block doesn't give us a hugely different result. It's still fairly similar. And the advantage of the city block, if you're doing sort of large processing or have really large data sets, is that you then have everything is integers, that you can never end up with fractional values. And when you use Euclidean distance maps, then you end up with lots and lots of sort of irrational values, and this can be computationally quite intensive. It also means that sort of errors will propagate depending on how you calculate this image. And so if you have, square root of 2 here, and then this is then 1 further than that point, and you can end up with a lot of these estimation errors that make it difficult to have an exact distance map, or more challenging. And so if we want to see sort of how a distance map is created in a very inefficient approach, I don't know why. Okay, I guess Zoom doesn't work there. That we sort of have this masked image, which is sort of a test object that we're looking at, and that we can sort of start off with everything set to 0. And then we basically perform sort of dilations on this background image that we have, and we label each iteration with a new distance value. And so you can see here sort of how this progresses from being a fully empty image to a fully complete image as you go through the iterations, and the distance values get higher and higher. And so, how it's actually computed, there's many different approaches you can use. And in, I think both in KNIME and Python, you can choose what approach it uses to calculate it that have sort of advantages and disadvantages depending on what sort of system you're looking at. But this is just to kind of get a visual idea of what this distance map gives you. And then you can also see for an object like this why this distance map might be helpful. And so sort of trying to think ahead, why would this distance map be a better representation of these sort of string of pearl-like objects than just the segmentation itself? No ideas? I mean, if you were, for example, trying to separate the objects, how would the distance map help you do that? So if your task was to count the number of pearls in each row, would the distance map make that easier to do? No ideas. Okay. Yeah. So if you're trying to separate the objects in that specific problem, what you see here is that there's the very high points, of course, in the middle of these pearl or bead objects, where this value is then 15 or whatever number it says on that board, and the low values are then near the edges. And so if we were to take this image and threshold it, we could then easily remove these sort of narrow regions because those are much thinner than the main pearl objects. So we could threshold it and say that each one of these beads is now separate, and then you could count the number of beads that you had. You could then choose to regrow it afterwards to fill up your initial structure, but it gives you sort of an easy way to separate these different components without having to sort of analyze them in too much detail, so that the distance map gives you a representation that's much easier to work with than some of the other objects. One of the other useful things, or another useful thing you can get out of this distance map, is sort of the size of the objects. And so if you weren't, so right now you see, you could measure the volume, you could do component labeling or connected component labeling if you were interested in, and identify each one of these strings as being separate. But if you wanted to know how large these beads were on average, you would struggle to do that with just the component labeling, because all you would find out is that there's this bead. It's sort of anisotropic. It's much bigger in the x direction than it is in the y direction. It doesn't fill the bounding box very well, but that could really be thousands of different objects. The advantage you have with this is now you can say, what's the distribution of values we have in this distance map? And so the highest distance value you have is then sort of the largest, ball or radius that fits inside there. So it gives you a much better idea about the size of these objects than if you simply had the pixel or the shape, basic shape information. Boom. So with distance maps, we do have to be quite careful. And this is particularly important in areas like medical imaging, because we measure distances computationally in pixels or voxels. And when you do things like computed tomography imaging on a desktop device, the voxel size is isotropic. And so that means it's the same in every dimension. When you do experiments with certain types of sort of microscopy or MRI imaging, many times you don't have isotropic voxel sizes. And this means that when you make a distance map that's measuring the distance in pixels or the distance in voxels in your image, you actually have a distance that can't be translated to a real world value. Because a voxel is, maybe 1 micron in one direction, but could be 10 microns in the other direction. And so knowing how many voxels you are away isn't very helpful, because you're concerned with how many sort of voxels across and how many voxels down, because these have different sizes. And so when you have images like this, it can be very difficult to actually interpret what does this distance map mean in the real world. And so it's always calculated in this sort of pixel or voxel space, but having a measurement that you can then bring back to the real world is quite important. And so when you do have this anisotropic data, the easiest thing to do is, as part of the filtering, just resample the data set so that it's isotropic, so that you have the same dimension, the same size in every dimension, because then the distance map is meaningful again. If that's not possible, then you really have to spend a fair amount of time thinking about how you want to interpret the distance map. And sort of in the worst case scenario, you'll have to implement this distance map yourself with an algorithm that's able to take into account that the side lengths of the voxels are not the same in every direction. So that when we look at this, algorithm where you go through the image and you basically assign each pixel based on how far it is away from this closest background pixel, you have to take into account that the background pixel, that one pixel in Z counts 10 times as much as one pixel in X and Y, which is possible, But if you forget to take it into account, it basically makes your entire distance map useless. And so this is really important to sort of keep in mind when you're working with data sets like that, because a lot of them are anisotropic, and the tools will rarely tell you that you're doing something meaningless. That you can run distance maps on any image data you have, and it will rarely say that this doesn't make sense or that you're doing something wrong. And so it's important to think about how does this value you're calculating, or how does this map you're making translate to the real world. And particularly with sizes like this, because if it's not 10 to 1, if it's anisotropic where it's 1 by 1 by 2, you probably won't even notice that the values are off. You'll simply calculate all the values, publish it in a paper, and it will be wrong. But it won't be so far wrong that it will be completely unbelievable. It will just be wrong enough that no one can sort of get the same results, and you're not actually measuring something useful. Cool. So now, with the distance maps, we sort of did the foreground and background, where we had the beads as the foreground and that as the background. But actually, we can create 2 distance maps from this black and white image. And so instead of assigning this foreground and that background, we can flip those definitions. And so when you look at this, what we did before, the foreground to background tells us about the object size and the interior. The background to foreground then tells us about the distance or space between objects. And so we get these 2 maps out. This will tell us sort of how big the objects are. So when we look at the maximum value inside each object, it kind of tells us the radius a little bit. And when we look at this background distance map, we can see how far apart the objects are. And so here you can see where sort of the maximum values of this are, and that's where the points are furthest away from the closest objects. And so if the objects were all evenly distributed, the values you would see would be sort of kind of fairly level. And if the objects are sort of clustered close together, then you'd have a lot of pixels that are very, very low distances. And then you'd have other pixels which are far away from every object that have a very high distance. And so we can see that actually we get 2 pieces of fairly useful information from these kinds of analyses.
That's a question.
Yeah.
When you're looking at the distance, the size of the objects.
Yeah.
In these cases, they're relatively circular.
Yeah.
If they had crevices or if they had an odd shape, maybe instead of looking at the minimum distance, you might want to look at the average distance to the nearest background. So then you get the sort of, because let's say it has you've got a sphere with a hole drilled into it, almost touching the center. And that sphere would, the minimum distance would be to the mountain. No, the minimum distance would be to the hole would be very small.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I guess when you come to the distance algorithm, it's not necessarily the minimum. It might be, depending on what you're looking for and what you're dealing with, it might be maximum distance or medium distance.
Yeah. So well, complicated, it actually isn't so bad. The problem is that when you actually think about how you computationally compute this, that the initial definition we gave of the distance map is, where was it? Here. And so if you think about what this problem actually means from a computational perspective, it means you have to take each point in your foreground and compare it to every point in the background. And so if you wanted to switch this minimum to a mean, then you'd have to look at every single point in your background in order to calculate the distance at a given point. And for this image, of course, it's quite reasonable because it's 10 by 10 or 12 by 12 or something like this. But if you're looking at a real image where it's 1,000 or 2,000 by 2,000 by 2,000, then you have millions or billions of points, and then calculating the minimum distance from an object in the foreground to all possible points in the background can be quite difficult. That's why sort of this works well for minimum, because you can use lots of tricks to optimize this procedure. So For example, with this foreground pixel, once you've found this background pixel that's one away, you actually know that nothing can be less than one away. And so you don't have to look through any other pixels in your image. You're done. And then you can look at this pixel and say, rather than looking at all the background values, you can say I'm surrounded by points that are one away. And so I'm one away from the points that are one away, and so I'm two away. And so you can use sort of little tricks like this to make this computation quite quick. And if you were to take the mean distance from all the points in the background, there's probably tricks you could use as well. But
Smoothing, I'm just thinking you could pre-smooth, and then if you had some really odd shapes, it would sort of become regularized.
yeah, so we have the thickness map helps us analyze this a little bit better. But you could, in theory, do other things. I think they've just never been done because the computational burden of actually calculating it is so high that people would avoid it. But it's a fair point. So, yeah, we now have these two different types of object distance maps, and we can see sort of visually how they might be useful, but actually we rarely use distance maps in their own right. The distance maps are usually just a tool for getting to another kind of analysis rather than an analysis in themselves. And so if we take this distance map that we have, one of the things we can do is look at the histogram of this distance map. And so we can see for this object, the histogram is sort of this pink curve, I believe. Yeah. And this is a nice histogram, and so we can kind of look at what the maximum point is and figure out what's the maximum radius of one of these circles in the image. But looking at the histogram itself isn't very helpful because it has sort of a huge range of values, and we don't see, what we'd like to see would be maybe 4 peaks that would let us know there were 4 objects, and those are the radius of the 4 objects we have. But we don't see that with this histogram. We just see sort of a smooth distribution. And so that's kind of why it isn't a useful tool as a final analysis value. One of the things that makes distance maps very useful for further steps in analysis is its kind of relative insensitivity to small changes in connectivity. And so if we remember before, like component or connected component labeling, that here we have 4 small circles. And if we were to analyze this with connected component labeling, we would get 4 separate objects that have different areas. Different centers of masses, different volumes, whatever we're calculating for this image. If we then move these objects a tiny bit closer together, and so rather than being a pixel apart, they're now touching. If you do the connected component analysis, you now find one very blob-like object that sort of isn't described by an ellipse nearly as well, that has this sort of hole in the middle, and is much more messy to describe. And when we think from sort of an experimental perspective, these 2 images are identical. The experimental setup, because you have noise, because you have sort of artifacts, because every time you mount the sample, you might mount it a little bit differently, because your zoom on your camera isn't always completely fixed, from any number of factors that can sort of enter into your process, it's clear for us that both of these images could easily come from exactly the same sample. And so when we're doing further analyses on these samples, we don't want to have an approach that gives a sort of factor of 4 difference in the analysis. And so that's where having a distance map is very helpful, because we can look at sort of this histogram, which is kind of a pseudo-analysis for this object, and we can see that the image before and the image afterwards are very close together. And sort of how much the values change when you move something very small is what we typically define as sensitivity. And so for those of you who've taken sort of mechanical engineering classes or control systems classes, the sensitivity is officially defined as kind of the slope of this curve of a given metric or a given output of your system over, so the differential change in the output over the differential change in the input. And so here, the differential change in the input is 1 pixel that you've moved, and the differential change in the output is a factor of 4 difference in the number of objects and in the area of the objects that you have. And so the sensitivity of that metric is then very, very high, which is bad, because if you have noise in your system, then you're sort of amplifying that noise very strongly. And we see here that when you take that same sort of analysis, that this difference, of course, this peak is a slightly different height, and the shape here is a little bit different, but for most of the bins and most of the values that we have in this histogram, they're exactly the same. And so this would be then an insensitive metric to those small changes, and those are the sort of metrics we want to have when we're doing larger scale analyses, where we're analyzing hundreds of samples and where we want to have results that are reproducible. So now we can go back to kind of this cell image that we had before, and we can calculate the distance map from it. Of course, if you're interested, you can see actually how this distance map is calculated in the handout. So all of the code is available that shows you what's actually done to calculate these distance maps. But understanding the code, I think, is not important. It's understand how you interpret these values and do something meaningful with it. And so here we have this single cell, and we have the distance from the surface. And what's nice here is that we see these points that are very thin, that we sort of assumed were separating these 3 different cells together, or separating these 3 different cells, are now sort of dark blue, and the centers of the cells are much brighter. And so we can visually see where we could easily cut these objects in order to separate them. Similarly, with the background, for this example, it's not as useful, but it gives us some information sort of about the shape of this docking site that we had before. And so what we can see here is, it's not sort of a consistent value or a constantly increasing value, that there's sort of this much larger low-valued region than you'd expect if the object were perfectly spherical or perfectly sort of box-like. Boom. And so I think we can take a short break here, unless there's any questions about distance maps. Okay, so we'll take a short break, and then we can move on.